Okay then.
Okay, I got that. Now I'm not recording because I don't have permission, but that's okay. I don't need to have that.
We give you permission.
It's not necessary, actually.
Can we call Hakan, Hasan for for the last check?
I checked the link for Hakan.
I don't mind if you want to postpone for a few minutes. I have no other plan for this afternoon, so it's not a problem at all for me.
This is really a pleasure for us, this invites for us. And I want to show the new issue.
Yeah, I saw it on Twitter. Actually, it came up on Twitter. I was very pleased. And my friend Christian Book posted it. And I was glad to see him. He's a very good friend of mine. I love his work.
At this week, I will send you its posts.
Yeah, so of course, but it's not
I
nice to see that it exists.
Your pages.
Oh, wow. Okay. All right. I remember that's a new picture. Yeah, that's good.
We translated 3 poems and 1 article. Really a good issue for us.
Okay, then Hasan, let's start without Hakan.
Okay.
And then. Okay, then Charles, thank you for joining us.
Well, it's great to be with you from Brooklyn, New York. I'm right in a little cube inside my garden in my brownstone here in what they call Carroll Gardens. It's actually an old Italian neighborhood. So that's what you're seeing behind you. And it was a great pleasure to get your questions and to have my work appear in the new issue of the magazine.
Thank you, Charles. For your collaboration and for joining us. Actually, you gave us an interview. It was really great with knowledgeable answers. It was really fruitful for us. But we are here to meet you online. Before let me introduce you, my friends. Actually, Hasan is a member of us as a poet, as a lawyer, and he shoots documentaries as well. Gizem is our translator. She translated your essay, The Dollar Value of Poetry, and a test of poetry as well. And she studies American literature. Am I right, Gizem?
Yes,
at university. It's 4th year, I think, her 4th year this year. And Charles, for maybe last a couple of weeks, more than a couple of weeks, I've been reading your text, your poems, and if I were to summarize your bio, I would say a life in and through poetry. Really, it's full of poetry. So not as just as a poet, as a critic, as a theorist, publisher, and so on. As a lecturer as well. You are now retired, as far as I know, from the.
Yes, I retired from my job as a professor at the University of Pennsylvania.
So you don't teach anymore at the moment.
Nope.
So how is your life? Can you adapt your life without students?
Well, that's a great question. Sometimes I think a lot of people, especially people I come into contact with for the first time in formal context, will ask me questions that I've been asked before, because they're going back over things, from often 30 and 40, 50 years ago. But in this case, of course, this is a new question. So anybody's asked me that question, well, except friends. Well, so I have an odd history with teaching because I didn't really start to teach or had anything to do with universities till I was about 40. I went to college and then I did other things. And then through my essays and poetry, I got this fantastic job at the State University of New York in Buffalo, where we started a program called the Poetics Program with Robert Creeley and Susan Howe, Dennis Tedlock and Raymond Fetterman. And that was really, they hired me as remarkably as a full professor, which is unusual for people in universities. So or with a chair, so I was already at the kind of the best possible job. Yeah. Freelance work was a shock. But I had never really taught much before. And that was 30 years. So I taught until I was 69. I moved to Philadelphia, to Pennsylvania, to teach at Penn. And I was totally absorbed in teaching all those 30 years. I read something every week by every student that I had. So I did classes so that people would respond to whatever we were reading, and they would write short responses. And so I read, you know, these responses every week for these 30 years. And just preparing the syllabi, which was kind of like an art form for me. It was a huge part of my life. So stopping was a huge thing, but I don't feel that I don't really miss it. Not that I didn't love it. It was a wonderful experience, but I really feel like I did it enough. And I'm very happy to sort of be back onto my own resources and doing things like this correspondence with you and talking to you on my own terms. And I have a lot of things like that to do, and books to read, and people that I'm in email conversation with. So I have more to do than I have time for. But I'm sort of free from the obligation of being in touch with people who are students, and even supervising graduate students. I had a lot of graduate students who got their PhD. So I find it totally enjoyable. Also, I feel, you know, I'm 71 now. I retired when I was 69. It's some of my friends like to stay on for a long time, and I understand that. But I think to some degree, that's a good time to retire, because the concerns of the students, the nature of the institution changes so much. If you're younger, you'll do what you have to do to keep up with it. But now I feel liberated from having to deal with a lot of the politics, the social environment, the current concerns. Because I did that my whole life, so I'm happy not to. And I think it's actually a difficult changing period in American universities now. A lot of the values are shifting, as they did before, but I think for older people, you really have to sort of reinvent what you do. And I'm just as happy to be out of it. Happy, of course, that I miss the switch to Zoom. Here, I'm happy to be on Zoom with you, but I'm also happy not to be doing Zoom teaching. I like teaching in person, as do most people. So the whole problem with COVID is, of course, you know, tremendously difficult thing in terms of protecting people's health, but still giving them the education. So I missed all of that. I got out just before that. You guys are all in the middle of it. You have to think about all those issues of live classes and all the rest. Yeah, but I leave it to you and your generation.
Okay. So you are happy with your new life. And, you know, every poet wants a life, you know, without any obligation.
I could have just said that. I could have just done the one sentence. I'm happy with my new life. My problem is I tend to go on and on and on. But actually what you said is probably a more concise answer.
Yeah.
But every poet, in a way, longs to have free time. So it's you know, it's not a problem for me. Freer. Time is never free, but it can be freer. More free.
Charles, I don't want to bother you with detailed questions, but a couple of general questions regarding some, different aspects of poetry. First of all, what's the aim of poetry for you? Can it still influence the people in times of, fluid modernity, digital panopticon? So what's your opinion on that?
That's a classic question. It hardly bothers me, but it's a perennial. I always go back to the idea that art is a possibility to explore imaginative intelligence, as my friend Paul Beauvais says, or a space of freedom. And it's without, for me, utility or the purpose of conveying something that I had in mind before I was writing. So it's an area of open inquiry. However, I'm aware that all of those terms are extremely problematic, and you could say that it's a kind of delusional, and it is, but I rather like this delusional space. So in other words, even if the idea that poetic freedom is delusional, I like that about poetry, that it's a delusional space of poetic freedom. For me, it's better than a delusional space of conformity, convention, and bureaucracy. So perhaps life is always to some degree a delusion, but I bring out the ludic in the delusion. That is to say, the playfulness, the aesthetic pleasure. So it needs to say pleasurable for me. It needs to let me think about things in a different way even than I have before. It's very easy when you've written stuff for 50 years, as I have, not to fall back on the same kinds of things. And I do to some degree. But one thing I do discover is that some things that I write really disturb me. They trouble me. I wonder if they'll be misinterpreted. Maybe I'm saying the wrong thing. Maybe I'm pushing it too far. And that's a good thing. It's good to have a certain level of anxiety and not feel complacent. So for me, the work exists without the need for justification. And I leave it to others to determine whether it's worthwhile for them to read. But of course, I do hope that people read the work, and the work of people that I care about, I put forward, I profess. I also recognize that in the US, but not just in the US, certainly in Europe and in South America, poetry is a very unpopular field. It's a very obscure thing. People keep up with pop music, with streaming TV series, with the news, with novels to some degree, movies, political biography, but poetry doesn't really exist as an area that has a substantial claim on popular culture. But for me, that doesn't make it less significant. I always say it's the irony that in a way that's what makes poetry especially significant. Not that I wouldn't be happy for things to be different, but given that's the condition, then you can work in ways that these other genres can't work. So with every limitation, there are possibilities, and to accept those possibilities is what can make for powerful art and for powerful poetry. Because poetry, the fact that it is so insignificant in the wider culture, both in the intellectual culture in universities and the national culture, as well as the popular culture, but certainly the high intellectual culture as well, is very striking, because after all, poetry is the art of language, verbal language. Verbal language always remains fundamental within our culture and our society. So if the art form that actually most potentially can reflect upon verbal language is so marginal, it becomes even more urgent to continue with it and to allow its neglect to become part of how it enters into the world. Because the neglect of poetry in our culture is, to my view, a detriment to our culture. There are many things that are very detrimental about US culture. And this does reflect something problematic. So I don't have a, I mean, I do have a very strong sense of the value of aesthetics and poetry and what the loss of valuing aesthetics and poetry is within a culture. And I certainly experienced that in the United States, although there are many people who are, you know, who share my view. I'm not alone, but it's a significant group.
I think, Charles, it's the same all, you know, across the world.
Minority.
But by the way, Hakan has joined us, our poetry editor, and he's a poet, both conventional.
It's very good to see you. Nice to meet you.
This cover, you know, was drawn by Hakan, and all of our covers.
Ah, okay.
Besides, you know, two of my poetry books as well, you know, was drawn by him. And he's our poetry editor, Buzdokuz. By the way, I think I told you before, Buzdokuz means ice 9. And it's a term from the novel by Kurt Vonnegut.
Cat's Cradle.
Cat's Cradle.
Ah, Kurt Vonnegut, Cat's Cradle.
Yeah.
You know, the ice 9 is a substance, you know, which is probably brings the end of the world in that novel. Have you?
I read that novel a very, very long time ago. So, maybe 40, maybe at least 40 or 50 years ago. So my knowledge of it is
you know, we are as a,
but I remember what Cat's Cradle is. Cat's Cradle is the game you play with your hands with with string.
Just my last question, and then because you know I asked 9 or 10 questions before, so.
But I have so many. My answers are so long. You ask me the one question, and I go on very long.
So we can interrupt you.
Good.
Because,
please.
Yeah. My last question is kind of personal questions. You know, it's sometimes, you know, I think of these questions as a poet about the definition of poetry. You know, especially the Western definition of poetry distorts our view of the longer human experience. You know, I mean, there are two main roles for poetry. One is playing with the language, and the other, you know, one focuses on life, you know, in an urge to speak, in an urge to change life. You know, the thing is that you cannot change life without changing the language, and vice versa. You know, as Marx says, you know, the point is to change, not to interpret. So I think that you combine them together. And this is a kind of paradox, you know. What's your opinion on that? You know, thinking of Wittgenstein as well, and language poetry as well. You know, carry on, please.
Well, I mean, I so much appreciate your comments. I would just want to say yes. I don't have an answer to that, and I don't have a way out of what you're calling the paradox. But I would say that I'm very interested that I'm together with you right now, right in this moment, with this conversation, because I'm in Brooklyn and you're in Turkey. Are you in Istanbul?
Yeah, I'm in Istanbul, and Gizem, and in Istanbul.
I was in Istanbul once. I was in Istanbul in the mid-1970s. Before I really had published anything. I was very young. I was about 25. I spent about 10 days there. with my wife. Yeah, we had a great time, but I haven't been back. I'd like to go back. But in any case, I mean, here I am in one of the most, we're both in among the most populous cities in the world, but there wouldn't be a whole lot of people in my neighborhood, much less New York, who I would be having this conversation with. And perhaps that would be true, I imagine so, in Istanbul. That is to say, I'm really interested in the fact that you and I, or not just you and I, but the six of us are brought together and can have a conversation, that you could do that magazine and ask me questions and translate it, and that it makes sense to us. And I'm really interested in these kinds of affinities and exchanges. Not even that you fully understand what I'm saying or that I fully translate or understand what you're saying, but just the connection itself, the kind of coming together where like cats cradle, perhaps intertwine ourselves or going back and forth. Because a lot of people that I know would not accept the premise that you made, that if we change, in order to change the world, we have to change language. And you seem to think that might be the case. I do think that that's so, but I also know that there's a lot of hostility to that idea. There's a lot of idea that poetry should be conveying various kinds of positions or experiences that are not in language, but they're conveyed through language, and that the words you use aren't going to change what that is. So for me, part of the struggle with poetry is to make visceral how much it's a means of perception, and that changing the terms and the language changes what that perception is. And however, I don't think that's what poetry is. I think poetry is an ancient art form. And it's quite interesting that somebody who's, the grandchild of immigrants living in Brooklyn, but my grandparents certainly didn't, working in English, the language that my father learned as his second language. And you're in a very deep, long tradition in Turkey of poetry going back thousands of years, potentially. Aspects of my own background go back those thousands of years, depending on what you think of what that is. But writing, certainly in the tradition that I might connect to, can go back a few thousand years. It means that's a very powerful thing. We're using the term poetry for that in Turkey and me in New York. But it means so many different things to so many different people. And like politics, and even like love, there are conflicting ideas of what it is and what counts and what's legitimate. I mean, even with love, there's a long history of certain kinds of love being denied. That's not, this isn't real love, that can't be, or not a proper kind of love. So there's no way that we're going to unify a definition, unify the definitions of poetry, except in the most generic sense that it's the art of verbal language. But certainly within different traditions, and that's what interests me, because the traditions are not the same, that you and I can be talking here, on Zoom through this video feed, and talk about something about the non-instrumental nature of poetry, something about the fact that language affects change, and that if you want change, you have at least to consider the words that you're using, or the phrases, or the syntax, or the overall language, and make that kind of connection. That's one kind of poetry. Just like societies are not all organized along one system. So you could talk about politics, but there are different systems of organization. And even democracy is not one thing. Monarchy is not one thing either, for that matter. Theocracy is not one thing. So for me, it's necessary to talk about the partiality of poetry and the limited ways that it means things in particular cultures and spaces, but then how it can connect up across a synaptic leap within your own culture and across cultures. No, I don't know if that answers your question, but
no, yeah, it's quite fine for me, and it's still a paradox for me as well.
right. Well, I wouldn't feel good if I eliminated the paradox.
Yeah,
in fact, I'd like to proliferate the paradox.
You are right. Anyway, and you, Charles, when I read your essays on poetry, I see that you avoid institutional supports, you avoid mass media, and you avoid populism, and you want to stay in margins. Am I right?
Yes, you're right. I mean, I always like to say about that it's not that I wouldn't welcome to be more popular. I'm not again. I'm always happy when work gets some attention within the mainstream media or the nationally circulated magazines. So, and I wish that they would cover the things that I would like them to cover more. So for me, it isn't like it's better to be on the margins, but I also recognize the difficulty of that occurring, while at the same time working to create alternatives that are powerful and are ready and able to take over the mainstream. There's another paradox about this, which is that in some ways, what I'm interested in, the tradition of, let's just talk about American poetry, that I've been articulating with dozens of friends and colleagues and co-workers and collaborators, since the mid-70s, that could be understood, and for you might well be the mainstream of American poetry and literature. And I taught it, great jobs, very prestigious jobs, and it could be that what is really fundamentally marginal and trivial is what gets covered in the mainstream, is the commercial culture that we're involved with, because the commercial culture has no real interest in aesthetics or the value I'm talking about. So there's the kind of, to use the title of my new work, a kind of a topsy-turvy world. In which it's good not to valorize being, I'm against valorizing being a rebel or being transgressive. I'm not interested in any of those things. I'm interested in doing what I do. And I also keep in mind, the great Italian political activist and thinker, Antonio Gramsci's distinction between the counter-hegemonic and the hegemonic. So it's a popular word within political theory, to be counter-hegemonic. But counter-hegemonic, being against what's dominant, isn't an end in itself. It's a necessity. The desire is to be hegemonic. I want to be, and I am, part of the larger hegemon of a culture that you and I can be together in and have a cup of Turkish coffee in Brooklyn and a baklava after a pastrami sandwich. I want that world to exist, and that world does exist if we insist on it. So I would say that a lot of people who are in the mainstream and who promote commercial culture are extremely marginal in what they're doing and their significance. And even a lot of poetry that gets a lot of attention because of its backstory or who wrote it rather than what's written also is marginal. So margin and center are dialectical terms. Maybe that would be the one sentence. I should have just said that.
Yes, you are right. The danger for a poet is, the mass culture and the powerful institutions. They normalize your spirit, your different aspects. So that's the main danger for me, I think. That's why I adore your position toward the main all the main roads.
But it's very important, because in America there is a kind of glamorization of the beat, the bohemian, the rebel, the counterculture. I mean, and that is mainstream. That is an aspect of mainstream culture. And I grew up, I was 18 in 1968. I see the glamour, but I'm not, or rock and roll. That's not what I'm interested in. I'm not interested in the position of being a rebel for the sake of rebellion. And I think that's an easy thing to get stuck in. And it's hard not to feel that way sometimes if you feel that you're contesting a whole range of different things. But what you're contesting could have substance without wanting to simply just be involved with debunking, just be involved with undermining. That is not interesting to me. I'm not interested in debunking. I'm interested in reformulating. I'm interested in the visionary. I'm interested in imaginative intelligence.
Yeah, Charles, I didn't mean the popular counterculture as beat or hippie and so on. Thank you, Charles. My other colleagues are waiting for.
Yeah, I didn't think you meant that. I just think that that's something that is as a cultural part of the culture that I live in. I have discussed that in the interview with you. I remember that now. You asked me something about that, so I might have said that, but I didn't hear that coming from you. But it definitely is part of the the culture that I'm in, that I live in, that's what's made glamorous.
Yes.
And
so, Hakan, or do you have any question to ask to Charles? Okay.
Well, there's my early.
I have a question
essays.
from Content Stream.
Yeah.
You say in the book, there are no thoughts except through language. We are everywhere seen through it, limited to it, but not by it.
Yes, that's very Wittgensteinian. That formulation really is a kind of a formulation of the philosophical investigations by Ludwig Wittgenstein.
What I deduce from this phrase is that we are not limited by the language when looking at the poem. Am I right? Can we dream anything outside the content? Or if we say like Derrida, is there anything outside the text? Or should we think of poetry as an art of language?
This is such a kind of a fundamental poetic and philosophical point, and easily misunderstood. But one part of what you're saying is significant. People often say when something terrible happens, I have no words for that. For example, a condolence. I have no words to express my sorrow or my grief for what you are going through. And unfortunately, one can't help but hear that and be in a world in which terrible things happen every day. Of course, I appreciate that sentiment, but I always want to say the opposite in a sense. I have only words for that, because the only way that I can come to terms even with the most acute tragedy or the greatest ecstasy is through the metaphors and the language in which I speak. It doesn't mean that there aren't things that seem to be outside of that language, but nonetheless, they're conditioned by it and expressed by it. So even if I say, I have no words to express my sorrow that this terrible thing has happened to you, that is, of course, a verbal expression. It's in fact a cliche. It's a formula. It's like a prayer for saying something. It isn't without words. So it seems to me the objection to this view, which I often hear, is that of course there's a world that's exists pre-existing outside of human beings. If all human beings were gone, if there were no human beings, would there still be a world? It's like if a tree falls in the forest, would you still hear? But the question is, why would you be asking that question? What would it mean for us to be talking about a world without human beings? I do think, as a matter of fact, there's no question that there's a world, that there's an earth, that there's a universe that exists independent of human beings. But I don't think that my perception of it is independent of human beings, and my perception is language bound. It's like oxygen. So there may be something outside of the bounds, and indeed there is, outside of the bounds of human being, but my experience of the universe is as a human being. So I would make the analogous question, is there something beyond human being? And well, of course there is, but it raises a number of religious questions. Of course, some people believe that when the body dies, it goes on, that there's any number of religious views about what exists outside of human being. But for me, what I know, what I experience has to do with the human body, the human perception. And so I feel that I exist inside of verbal language, and that verbal language is able to allow for the expression of anything I feel, because it comes from what I feel and what happens to me.
What I meant is other mediums.
I would be wanting to express that didn't already happen.
Oh.
Sorry. What I meant is other mediums or formations like concrete or visual poetry. Can we call an installation a poem too?
Yes. Well, I mean, I may have answered a different kind of question than you asked, a more ontological question, but yeah, I think that visual poetry, sound poetry, other kind, the range and possibility of what the form of poetry can be will often stretch verbal intelligibility to its limits, so you more see certain aspects of it. So I certainly think that working with visual language, even fracturing it, overprinting it, and so on, is a kind of poetry that explores the visual materiality of language. And the same with sound, that you see how it works as a kind of sheer medium. And it's this medium aspect that interests me. And to tie up the two questions, so there are ways in which visual poetry and sound poetry explore the medium, medium, of poetry. But the word medium also has a very interesting other meaning, which is that a medium is somebody who receives signals from outside. You're a medium. So I like that aspect of that a medium is also something that receives, it's the receiver. And that's why I say, for me, it isn't the question that there's nothing outside, but that you're talking about how you're receiving what that outside is. And then you can, as if you were a radio, you can distort the signal. You can become more aware that you're not looking at something transparent. You're actually looking at a mediated image.
Another question, Hakan?
Yeah, I have I have a couple of questions. Maybe there are overwhelming ones.
Since you are a visual poet as well, I think your questions are more regarding, visual arts, maybe.
I have some philosophical questions.
Ontological, maybe.
And poetical. In Anti-Oedipus, Deleuze and Guattari says that writing has never been capitalism's thing. Capitalism is profoundly illiterate. What I am getting from these words is capitalism has no idea about poetry. It has nothing to do with poetry, since the poetry remains in the dark side of the capitalism or monetary system or established order, like dreams or charity, like the verse of Simon Weil you quoted in your article, every effort of love or thought. Poetry has no use or exchange value in the market, so poetry finds its origins in the disinterestedness. What is the dollar value of poetry? Is it an ironic way to say poetry is useless? or does poetry have subversive power against the signifying logic of the system?
Well, I don't want to have to answer because I just would say yes. I love what you're saying. I loved Anti-Oedipus when I read it. It was a great book. I'm very sympathetic to Anti-Oedipus, and you know, all that you say is very much along the lines that along my lines. So I feel very much of a comrade with you in all of that. As you know, time goes on, I like to try to reverse my own positions. So of course, the subtitle of Anti-Oedipus is Capitalism and Schizophrenia. It's, you know, I mean, capitalism, I said all of those things in my early work. I'm not sure I would use the word capitalism right now, not because I don't agree with it, but because it's, it feels so much like fate to I don't see anything outside of it. So it wants to have poetry within it. But of course, it is true that the argument that I'm making and that you have just said for poetry has to do with it not being involved with utility or with a dollar value. So it's not about converting it into something that has a commodity value. And I certainly do still think that, but I'm not sure that capitalism is so rapacious and large that it can't accommodate for that too. And we have to recognize the way in which capitalism does allow for pockets of art and non-utilitarian culture to function. And it's important to emphasize within capitalism the value of that, or else our own means of living or having access to Zoom will be taken away. So because universities are turning against, are becoming more bureaucratized, more capitalistic in the US, it's important to try to create spaces, even within those institutions, that allow for poetry. So I do have a pragmatic side. The only term I would focus on in what you said, and it has to do with the purpose or purposes of art, is disinterested. That's a kind of Kantian idea, I guess. I'm not sure that I would use the term disinterested. I would say it's other interested in something else. So that my other interest, my passion, is just as interested, but it isn't involved with interest rates. It isn't involved in accumulation of monetary value, but it is still interested. And it does also involve, honestly, accumulation of cultural value, which is problematic, but also necessary to operate. In other words, to be able to just to do the things that I do, or that we both do sitting here, requires a certain amount of cultural capital, or else we will, be completely obliterated. So I do put a lot of time into organizing and trying to create spaces and archives that allow for the kinds of activities that I believe in to exist. And I'm not of a view that any kind of compromise of that kind is contaminating, which I'm not a purist. In fact, I'm a deep impurist. So I think one has to have, like they say in economics, a mixed economy or a mixed mode. It's important to be pragmatic, in other words. It's important to survive. It's important for poetry to survive even in an inhospitable host. And so it has to find ways to coexist within that inhospitable host. Because I don't think I think that the way things are, at least in my lifetime, is going to go on. I don't see a transformation toward. And furthermore, I'm against the idea of hoping for, or utopia, that things will be better in some way. I don't think things will be better. In fact, unfortunately, I think things could conceivably be worse because of politically global climate change and so on. So I think one has to find ways to operate within an inhospitable host to make the kind of space that's represented to me by talking to you on this this call.
Another question, Hakan, or
If we have time, if you have some time.
I have all the time in the world.
Okay, then thank you,
Okay.
Charles.
Poetry is not made of ideas, but words.
Yeah.
This statement is quoted from Mallarmé. You read in your interview with Dworkin a parody poem from your book,
Right.
Top Story. Yeah. By quoting and transforming, you make permutations, as I understand, as far as I understand. Do you think parody is an intrinsic, constructive, or subversive power in all arts? Or is it a simple technique which we can ignore? For example, T.S. Eliot says immature poets imitate mature poets' tale.
Right.
Or Reinhardt says all art comes from the other artworks, or artist comes from other artists. We learn how to paint by following the masters, I mean. Heidegger thinks that all art is allegorical. What's your opinion about regarding parody?
Parody.
Yeah. You have so
Which is
many
a comic,
allusions,
which is a comic dimension. I mean, parodies to some degree is comic, no? Humorous, comic.
Sometimes.
Good answer. I loved your question. I really think my response, as with the last time, is takes away from what I appreciate about what you're saying. I only would want to say, but I can. I'm happy to speak about what you said, but I like what you said. I want to sign. I want to sign on the to that. Even as a question or not, I'm very feel very close to the issues that you're mentioning. And I certainly think it's very important to make parodies of T.S. Eliot, who I love, but you can only love him if you parody him. Well, you're speaking to a person who is very involved with parody and the comic and the satiric and irony. So and very kind of uncomfortable with certain aspects of sincerity as in contrast. So I certainly think those things are valuable and crucial. I do think it's possible within poetry for people to write in a non-parodic way, at least in the humorous sense, in that sense of word. But you're actually saying something that's more complicated and harder to get outside of when you're saying not. It's like irony. I have a line in one of my poems, the famous Socrates line, that the unreflected life is not worth living. I say the unironic life is not worth living. The unironized life is not worth living. But I would say to some degree, like the parody, irony in that sense, self-reflection is itself ironic and parodic. So to think is parody and irony. Now, I know a lot of people don't feel that way. A lot of people really believe in a kind of rooted, sincere authenticity. And I hear that. It's not my, especially people with deep beliefs, often people with religious beliefs. There are certain things that are sacred that you can't make fun of, you can't satirize, you can't relativize. I'm not one of those people, but I hear that as an important part of human culture, and I'm not an epistemological suprematist. I don't believe that my way of looking at what's valuable and knowledgeable is the only one. I think there are other absolutely contradictory ones, and I wish to live in peace with these other epistemologies. However, often these other epistemological perspectives would like to destroy folks like me or people who think what I think. So that I'm less comfortable with. So if we can have a coexistence, it's good. But if one view says, no, that can't exist, then, it's a problem. It's a problem. But you make a more profound point, really, that a non-ironic parody based on the idea that we are parasitic even on the culture that we're in, and that we absorb. See, parasitic is a problem with the word. Para is just next to, like parallel, but parasitic suggests something bad. But I would say if we could have a sense of it, as you're saying with parody, an ode next to, all that I am is absorbed from the culture that precedes me and the culture that surrounds me. So yes, I think everyone who uses human language, human culture, is completely immersed in the past, in tradition, in other, if we're poets, previous examples of poetry that we know, as well as the contemporary language and cultural world that surrounds us, and that we're porous, that enters into us. We can't stop it from entering. We can't make ourselves resist that. And in fact, I would say we embrace it. It's like swimming. You swim within it and you move around, but you still have the water that you're diving. But you also pretend that you're not amidst that cultural water. So I do agree with the implication that you're saying that you can't really get outside of parody. But I also understand why some people might be very uncomfortable with that. And I can hear that too. It's like the paradox, go back to another paradox, if I might say, there are no absolutes, and that's not an absolute either. How can, when you say there's no absolute, that itself is an absolute. I mean, it's parodic itself, but you get back to that conundrum that to say that there can only be parody, it could be a misan abim. It could be self-canceling, because then we just have everyday life. Everyday life is filled with contradictions, multiplicities. We navigate through it. There's no one clear, direct way. Some people feel there is, and God bless them. As long as they don't try to mow me down in making that clear, direct way, Godspeed. But for me, the way is always crooked and multiple.
Yeah. My following question regarding that issue, Hegel thinks that thought is stretching its wings over the artwork. There should be an idea or story behind the poetry, accordingly. Greeks call it dianoia or mythos. Do you agree with that idea? Hegel gives an example of a child who is holding a pebble, flat pebble in his hand and throwing into the ice. The pebble is leaping a couple of times. Is causing a ricochet. Hegel thinks that the origin of art, you cannot think the child without his environment. It's not a separate thing. Maybe he's upset, or he's angry, or he's happy with his friends or with his brother. Politics and the poetics in the art form is intertwined each other.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard for me to respond to that. We have these supervening and absolutely informing ideas of what art is from Kant and from Hegel, especially those two. And with Hegel especially, if you're, and Marx as well, turned, topsy-turvy. After all, Marx is, they say, is the topsy-turvy Hegel, or makes Hegel seem topsy-turvy, turns him on his head, right? So my title of my recent book, Topsy-Turvy, relates to that. As to, one of the issues has to do with the so-called base or the superstructure. We keep going back to this issue. What is the origin of our cultural ideas? and is it autonomous or not, and to what degree? And I don't want to directly give a philosophical answer to that. I think that there are multiple different kinds of origins that art has in different cultures, and I think that I am not Hegelian in the sense that I think that there's some over a human arch that creates some universal story. I think that the differences are more important than what is had in common, and I think we do. We lose a lot when we try to see what's the common human thread philosophically in a whole range of different activities. So I think poetry, even in the United States now and historically, has had many different approaches, like politics, to this question. And some poets have taken a more Mallarmeian view, art for art's sake, and I'm certainly close to that. Others have the opposite view. They're both, I wouldn't want to take away the word art for that, but for me, art is always involved with a contest around issues like that. Nature of reality. What's the nature of truth? What is I say at one point in one of my poems, I'm not interested so much in what is truth as what is false, which goes back to what you're saying about parody. My own interest is in a way more like an earlier title of mine again, The Sophist. I'm interested in the ways in which falsification operates within the culture, and playing with that and making that visceral and even aestheticizing that kind of falsification. And so I'm not at all interested in universal truths. I'm interested in understanding how universal truths are often controlling and derealizing. So what I try to grapple with and grasp in writing poetry, and even talking to you, is the multiple, complex, and sometimes contradictory textures of language in the present as I understand them, that don't allow for some kind of future that may or may not come, don't condemn the present as being lost to human value or human pleasure. So to allow for that dance and play of the mind through language and through the body in the present, and to put off these kind of metaphysical questions that that we can't help but think about, but it's not my task to profess.
To me, the only instruction.
I am not a Hegelian.
Yeah. To me, the only instruction for poetry is that there are no instructions.
Exactly. So that's my sensibility. Is that right? But even that must not be an instruction. You see, there's the third term has always to be. There's the sophism. Yeah. There's always a bit of the comic in that, but the comic is important. You want to recognize that you understand that, but it's the smiling, as we both are doing now, talking to each other, that moment where we're both smiling and laughing, that's, to me, more important than the absolute that the philosophers talk about. The laugh is more important than the absolute.
Yeah.
I think if I met the absolute wouldn't like me anyway, so I'm a little concerned.
That's the success of poetry, maybe, bringing people together and makes them laugh. That's the point, maybe.
That's right, and in provisional ways like this.
Yes.
And Hakan, do you have another question?
The last question. As far as I understand from your interview in Buzdokuz, you describe language as a side of conversation rather than a school or movement.
Right.
You said that its unity was not a set of conventional aesthetic principles, but rather a discontent to the conservative way of thinking on the poetry all the time. Mm-hmm. What was the tradition you deviated from in the late 70s? When you say language made a turn from some aspects of modernist avant-garde formations? Do you imply the epic tradition of poets like Ezra Pound or William Carlos Williams? Among the successors, can't we see names like John Cage, if not the Beat Generation, as an early break from this Whitmanian flow or Poundian tradition?
Yeah, I mean, this is something I take up a little bit in the written interview. I think a lot of what I was interested in, my friends too, and we did Language Magazine in the 70s, and our conversations was to bring forward writers who were less known, were less dominant in American literary history, sometimes quite obscure, sometimes entirely overlooked. And I think we succeeded to some degree. And I think that's often the case with poets or critics or thinkers. You kind of remap what that tradition is. But I'm not an either or thinker in respect to the historical past of poetry. So while I certainly want to see poets who are less known get something was repressed, it doesn't mean that the dominators are not also significant in their own way. In fact, I think when we have a fuller picture of the conflict and contradiction within the history of a national poetry culture like the United States, it doesn't diminish the people who are now joined by a larger company. It makes them more interesting. The conversation becomes more interesting. When there's just not one or two dominant players, when you have like an ensemble, that makes everybody more interesting. So it's easy to misunderstand this view. You know, as young poets, you're putting forward, you're seeming to say negative things about some of the people who are more dominant than less. I'm not mentioning names because I don't want it. I'm trying to talk structurally about it, but one could easily fill in the names. And then, you know, this is once again with retiring. You know, there's any number of different things that I read that I did not read when I was young that I liked very much, or poets. I certainly have preference for certain kinds of things rather than another, but I'm not. I don't necessarily, but I see those as my own particular preferences to some degree, based on who I am, you know, where I grew up, and the aesthetic values that I'm putting forward. So I think it's this view, in a way, the view that you've articulated in these questions, what you said, that you connect to, those are, that was the difference from the 70s to the present, because that was a different view. The view that I'm saying, that there are multiple kinds of poetry that can be viewed as different kinds of politics or different kinds of ideology, and that you can't say that one is better than another. In other words, against epistemological and poetic suprematism, against the absolutism, against the idea of the purity of poetry, that there's only one thing, and to say all kinds of other things are not poetry. When you contest that, as I do, that's actually what's disturbing, and that's different, because the traditional cast of mind does not accept this kind of multiplicity. It has to cast aside the infidels and has to have its true gods or its true idols. And when you say, well, everything is an idol, everything is a false god, people who believe in the true God aren't going to like that. And so I think that's actually what was unsettling, that structural argument, which is related to, indeed, the structural argument in Anti-Oedipus, because it is an Anti-Oedipus view. And that remains in the aesthetic realm. Even today, someone like me is a kind of persona non grata, because I don't subscribe to the dominant views of these esteemed cultural institutions, and that's not tolerable to them. They can't even argue with it. They have to completely pretend that it doesn't exist or dismiss it.
Sorry to interrupt, but it's related to Hakan's question. Do you diagnose the traces of language poetry today's American, scene? And do you say that, yeah, that's what I meant, that's why I wanted to see? So is there any tradition of language poetry today's American poetry?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there was a lot of there was a lot of impact. A lot of people. I think certain very like with not just that, but a number of things from the 60s, which could be compared to. There's a lot of ideas that are just accepted now that were not accepted before. I mean, to make a more not a perfect analogy, but one that is outside of poetry. Certain kinds of music, and not John Cage, but just rock and roll and so on, would have been viewed by my parents' generation as being noise, and nobody thinks it's noise anymore. You know, I mean, you do have change, you do have cultural change. It's not that rock and roll is good or bad, and in fact, being able to understand and hear things as noise is a value. But I do think that that those of us who were involved with Language Magazine and in general this radical rethinking of the American poetry tradition and aesthetics did have the effect of making credible stuff that was completely written off historically, that's now accepted to some degree. I think that nonetheless, the resistance to invention, innovation, and non-conventional poetic work is extremely powerful right now. Was in the 60s, you know, all through. It remains as strong now. It morphs. It takes on different kinds of qualities. The attacks become different. What's said as being bad becomes different, and so new arguments are used because it's a fundamentally destabilizing two very important ideas of meaning, self, identity, and expression, which for people are quasi-religious and they're not questioned. So if they feel you're questioning it, they get upset. It's like waving a red flag at a bull. But yes, of course, the conversation has transformed, morphed, and became other things. I was never interested in a school. I'm not interested in people following anything that I do, but rather a conversation. And so where I see it coming, what I take satisfaction in is the conversation that I'm having with you today, because you're saying things that I hear, that I understand, that I'm interacting with, and that makes me happy and also makes me feel, oh, well, all right, so we're able to have this conversation right now. That's the proof of the pudding in my mode, this conversation, because I think also America is trapped in America. It's stifling. It's not that it isn't a big, powerful country with a great literary tradition, but it's everything is often viewed just in terms of what it means in the 19th century, the 20th century, and it's very parochial for something that's as big as it is. And I think the hope, in my estimation, is to think of poetry more in non-national terms and to have conversations that go beyond those kinds of national histories and through translation and transformation. But that also means not holding on to, I have ideas. You may hear it and take it in a place that I never imagined, that may not be what I had in mind. That's what conversation is. I don't have a doctrine that's foolproof and it's, you know, you're going to unpack and it's going to be the same, like a Mac computer, going to have the same operating system. It's not like that. It transforms. The operating system changes. The apps change, but nonetheless, they're transformed in the contact.
Thanks, Charles. And Hasan, Hakan, have you finished your questions?
Yeah, I finished, but I remember a good example from Anglo-American poetry, St. Mark's Church, and there are figures, poets, artists. They were performing there. They're reading poems. They're reading articles. A great trio of American poetry. There are a couple, more than a couple of constellations or movements.
Right. Well, I mean, that's
yeah.
local to me.
Young poets, or elder
right.
ones.
I've been going to the poetry project at St. Mark's Church for since the mid 70s, so 45 years. Yeah, and there's a lot of different interactions that go on there of different generations and different schools of thought, and I feel very much a part of that world.
It was a very good experience for you.
Yeah, well, I mean, yes, that's a wonderful art center and has certainly, you know, comes out of a place that's very, very much connected to what I'm interested in. And there are various jobs at Buffalo, the poetics program, at Penn through Penn Sound, and our own teaching there. We also created centers, the Electronic Poetry Center early on, the web. So we tried to move some of those things to web context that allowed for even more exchange that didn't require people to be in New York.
Also, Ubu website.
Ubu Web, Kenneth Goldsmith
yeah,
is another.
Web,
It's kind of a site that
great
relates.
archive.
Right, right, and of course, and I've been involved with that from its founding. And Ubu was to some degree involved with the Electronic Poetry Center when it started, then with Penn Sound. So it's a somewhat different model of collecting, and that's a curatorial project extraordinary by one person, Kenneth Goldsmith. So it's but very, very closely connected. And that is also not such a US centered site either, which is a great thing about it. It's a very international site.
Yeah.
I mean, languages are always, it's hard to be an American poet with stuff in English. Of course, I'm completely immersed in US and English language things. And I'm not really knowledgeable in other languages to that degree. So you're all speaking to me in English, and that's not your native language. I'm not the opposite. So I recognize my own limitations when I'm saying that, but that's why I'm saying it, because I too am overly immersed sometimes in English and that cultural tradition. And I think it's, I'm interested in not, you know, in being aware of that.
Thanks, Charles. And Hasan, carry on, please.
Going well. I had a question about irony, but you answered well. I have a question about the fragments from 70th Manifest. Why did you use a pseudonym, Hermes Hermeneutic? What kind of irony does this name have?
What name? I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you there. Say again.
Hermes Hermeneutic. I want to learn cause a pseudonym.
A pseudonym? I'm not.
Yeah, pseudonym. Yeah.
Your manifesto that we translated, Charles. The seventh part of what was the name?
Fragments from the 70th Manifest of Nude Formalism.
I see. Right. Nude Formalism. Yeah.
Your name, Charles.
Yes.
I want to learn cause of the pseudonym, Hermes Hermeneutic. What kind of irony does
the pseudonym?
Name
the
have?
Pseudonym. Hermes Hermeneutic. The pseudonym.
Okay.
No, it's okay. It's just that, you know, it's the only way. You know, it's a Latin word. It's a pseudonym. Pseudonym.
Okay.
Yeah.
I will try it.
Why? You know, I don't. That's such a specific question. You know, goes back to the question that Hakan was asking about parody. I mean, pseudonym is intrinsically a parodic form. So in that case, it's a manifesto. So manifestos are I love, but also I find intrinsically comic. In fact, I find poetic images comic as well. I think there's one thing marvelously comic about poetry in general. You make up words, you make up descriptions of things, and it's fun, and it has a kind of a wit to it. In the case of manifestos, often they're very belligerent, and they're kind of saying, I'm for this rather than that. That's the nature of it. We're for, you know, this value and against that value, and denouncing one thing and putting forward in narrow terms certain kinds of specific things. And I see the value of that, of course. And I respect people who are, you know, want to articulate things in that way. But that's not it's not my way of looking at things. So in the case of my own manifesto, it's quite silly. It calls attention to itself by putting forward, you know, some relatively absurd proposals, together with ones that are not at all observed, that are actually quite specific to my own view, but it kind of undercuts even what I'm saying by making it comic. So, and to make a manifesto comic is almost to make it not a manifesto, but I would say the opposite. The manifesto, in that case, the 17th manifesto of nude formalism, that's what you were saying, so I never hear that said, by Hermes Hermeneutic. The manifesto is in a way for the parodic, to go back to our discussion of the parodic before. Can you have a manifesto that manifests or that advocates the parodic or the satiric? And I would say yes. And that is what I do, not only in that one poem or opening, but in that entire book of the nude formalism, which are all comic poems with traditional form, or anyway, mostly comic poems with traditional form. So it allows me to reverse some of the terms, for example, from Pound, which I discussed in the interview that's in your magazine. You could take certain propositions, use no word that does not directly contribute to a sense of things. Well, that's an important view. It's kind of Baroque and to writing that beats around the bush, that's fancy, that uses a lot of excessive language. But I say the opposite: use no word that contributes to the direct sense of a thing seen, because poetry isn't about the direct sense of a thing seen. Poetry is all a celebration of decoration. So sometimes just saying the opposite, you can get at something that's very powerful. As to the name Hermes Hermeneutic, well, you know, that's goes to the very heart of this whole conversation in a way. Hermes is the messenger from Greek mythology, of course. You're a lot closer to Greece than me, by the way. When I did go to Turkey, I was actually in Greece right before that, and I took the boat to Ephesus, right from like Athens, when I was a kid. It was great. So, I mean, I got that world. I'm just thinking of that now, so I'm looking at you and realizing, well, I'm far away from that world, but you're still in very close to Hermes and the Greek gods. It's for all of us who read Western literature, but Hermes is the messenger from God to humans. Maybe the messenger is the absolute we were talking about before, too, or something that's beyond language to language. So it fits into a lot of what we're talking about, and questioning whether there is some message that's being conveyed from the beyond, or whether it's all just interpretation. So hermeneutic, of course, is the word that comes from Hermes that we use in English, having to do with interpretation. And so it has to do with is there a world outside the text, was the way the kind of Derridian question that was asked earlier in this conversation. The hermeneutic idea might well be that there's only interpretation, or there's only translation, or there's translations of translations, but no original. But even the idea of original is a word in verbal language. I mean, but original does mean something different than translation. We can't, just like up means something different than down, but the terms exist within a system where, depending on how high you are or low, you could be up or down, depending on where you start. So that's where Hermes Hermeneutic, that character in a way, maybe that's who's been speaking this whole time during this Zoom meeting. It's not me, but Hermes Hermeneutic.
Thanks so much. I have another question. Do you think the 2 years we spent in a postmodern quarantine, in a pandemic, have this created a different understanding of thought or poetry? I'm asking both from your point of view and from the point of general thoughts and artistic adventure. Do we need to make a distinction between the possibilities and experiments of poetry as before and after the pandemic? in this sense, how did the pandemic period reflect on your work?
You know, that's a great question, and
I didn't get that. Could you try again?
wow. Oh, that's, you know, I love that. Oh my God. Did you hear that? The machine, I was trying to make it so it didn't make the beeping sound. It's the answer to your question. But I tried to turn off the do not disturb because I'd forgotten some of my text messages, so I wouldn't hear it. And I pressed another button and Siri said, I didn't get that. Can you say that again? So that's maybe that's the answer. You know, when terrible things happen, one pulls one's hair out, and when you're old like me, you don't have any hair to pull out anymore, so it's difficult. But with the little bit you grab on to, we're about hitting the 20th anniversary of September 11th, 2001, here in New York, and so I remember that was a terrible thing for New York. A lot of terrible things have happened elsewhere, all over the world, every year since that time. But you know, for those living in New York, it was a pretty amazing and horrific thing. Can you? Question would come up: what do we do? Can the poems that we're writing or the art live in the face of this? And you know, there's a crisis quite often since then. Pandemic being a different one. The pandemic also is intimately connected to the climate crisis and globalization, which we've been experiencing for a long time, because the pandemic is involved with the interweaving of our viral culture and bacterial, well, viral culture in this case, bacterial culture, and which we can't separate anymore. We try to stop plane flights and so on, but it's it reflects that. So I wrote poems responding to these specific things and to the larger questions. All of this conversation that we've had could be thought of as responding to the question of the human crisis, or the crisis of the human, or what I call sometimes animality, not animality, not animality, not being animal, but the malady or sickness of being animal, not even human. So the pandemic brings that out. And of course, Brooklyn, New York, here where I am, was one of the epicenters of the pandemic at one point. You know, a year and a half ago, anyway, we had the highest infection rate in these streets that I live in. So, but it was a global problem, and it remains a global problem. So I think, as I say in my work that I wrote in 9/11, it isn't whether art is up for this, but what else is art for? What else is poetry for? So I don't mean to say this as a point of pride, although, and it's hard not to, but everything I've always written has come out of a sense of crisis. So when the crisis occurs, it isn't like, oh, why am I still going to be doing this other stuff which seems irrelevant? So I know, even with teaching, people say, you're going back, I've had, you know, terrible things happen in your life, to all of us, and you go back into the class after this catastrophic thing happens, but it's not as if what I'm talking about, poems or like talking to you, is somehow not what I'm able to talk about under that circumstance, because that's what the poetry that I taught did speak to. So for me, it makes the necessity of the work, to go back to the very first questions you asked, why write? You know, what's the point? What you know, it makes the necessity even greater, and my commitment to work even harder, to be more disruptive, to question my own assumptions, and to also do that not isolated, you know, physically distant but socially intimate, like this is. We're physically distant, but we're trying to have a conversation, and then the necessity for conversation across barriers, so that our conversations will be as viral for poetry and as thought as the COVID is destructive to our bodies. We have to create poetry that's viral in an aesthetic sense, in a good sense, crossing those boundaries, breaking through and creating new mutations of poetry, new mutations of possibility to combat all of the biological and political, because the COVID crisis is of course biological, but it's fundamentally political as well. You can't differentiate those realms. They're completely interwoven. And we will see that in the years to come as to how that outcome is for this problem. In the same way that the climate change is a problem of the earth that seeps into the world. If the earth is the physical thing that's outside of the world, and in some ways, while poetry is in and of the world, the human world, it's the closest that we get to the earth.
Thanks, Charles. And Hasan, another question?
No, another question.
It's Gizem's turn. Gizem?
Well, last night I read your sad boy poem.
Oh, okay.
I love it. And my question is, do you like Sylvia Plath? And if so, what is your favorite poem of her?
Of Sylvia Plath?
Of Sylvia Plath, yeah.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting question. I mean, I don't know. I appreciate you saying that, and it fits into the question earlier again about parody and about and that now there's answering my own question that Hakan asked about parody, not necessarily a comic, because that's a parody that's not comic. That is to say, it takes the original and reworks it and extends it. It's more like a variation on a theme, but it could be understood in a technical way as a parody, but it's not. It's a celebration of and an extension of it. It's not comic. I don't about Sylvia Plath. I like many of her poems. I think that she, in some ways, she's so. Her story is so powerful, and her suicide so famous, that a lot of her poems are read simply as extensions of her biography, and that is important to a number of people reading, and more important than perhaps the aesthetic things that I find interesting about her. But I do feel that that the aesthetic innovation in her work is sometimes lost when she's viewed simply as a poet with a tragic life story, and that you're reading for biographical reasons. She also can be, of course, extremely funny, like in the Daddy poem, which I do like quite a lot too.
I have one more. It is a personal question. When I was a teenager, I used to write a lot of poems, but now I don't write anymore. So I want some advice from you. I want to start again. Actually, I want to be that girl, not this girl. I want to start again. So I want your advice on that.
It's like I'm tempted to give you a joke about a doctor. Take 2 aspirin and drink plenty of water and call me in the morning. It's not really an answer to that. The question is really why you would continue to write, not why you should start to write when you stop. I mean, why? I think the more interesting question is, how can I stop? I've not been able to stop. I think if you're not writing, God, you're better off. You're better off. You'll just bring you heartache and disappointment. I can't see any reason to encourage you to write poetry. So it's really something to do because you just can't do anything else, but not for any other purpose. And if you can do something else, then, by all means do it. I think those of us who stick with poetry, it's really, we're not, it's just, we're addicted to it. We'd like to stop. but we can't. So perhaps I'll leave you with that joke, and you can spin that around in your mind.
Thank you.
Gizem, have you finished or you have
Yeah.
another?
Mhm.
Okay, then you guys, do you have any further? Hakan, could you please unmute your mic?
Just one thing. When I see your cover, when I see the cover of Topsy Turvy, it reminds me the paintings of George Baselitz.
Oh yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
I could
The German
actually
painting.
let me do it. Let's see if we can
Yeah.
get it right. Yeah.
Your Topsy Turvy.
Yeah. Yeah, of course, that's by my wife, Susan B. But that's good. Now I'm in my topsy-turvy mode. This is actually, you know, I have to tell you, because it may, this is the way I am. Now the camera is right side up. I am actually standing on my head. I turned it around for the interview so you couldn't see it, but this is actually the way I've been the whole time.
Yeah, it reminds me of the paintings of Baselitz.
Yes, of course, hanging from the roof. Yeah, that's an excellent point. Well, and I think coming from a similar idea.
Thanks so much.
Okay, Charles, it's time to listen to a poem by you. Which one?
All right. Well, now that I've knocked the camera off. So what do you want me to read? What would you like me to read of the ones that you published? There's a couple of very short, the 3 short poems.
Well, it's up to you.
Well, I have the 3 short poems and the collaboration with Norman, which is much longer. You want me to read the whole set?
It's up to you, Charles.
Well, I'll read. I'll read you ones. I think these are the ones that are in. Did you published? Yes, the 3 short poems, and then this excerpt from Where Here Were We, right?
Okay.
So this is what's in the magazine, and the 3 short ones that are kind of pandemic related, or one is called Nettlesome Muse. Nettlesome Muse. The birds have never been noisier. They are chirping away like there's no tomorrow. The second is called Pandemania. It's hard to take it, but we're taking it. And the third of these is called Corona. So much not happening that the not happening is what's happening. Now, during the course of the pandemic, my friend, the Zen master and wonderful poet, Norman Fisher, good friend of mine, went back and forth and created quite a long poem. And this is just what we wrote from April 24th to April 30th, 2020. So it's one poem, but it's a bit longer, but it's by both Norman and me. And we gave the full title to the whole collaboration is Where Here Were We? Where Here Were We? Intubation can be a fool's errand. No luck on the highway. Relentless information pedals on a wet pink bow. You think? I met this guy, see, and he said, I owed him. Oh, you what? I say, astonished. You'll know in time, says he. The Swami don't sugarcoat the soldier's caution, just like optimism suffuses the crisis with meaning. Bacon and eggs for breakfast, toast by lunch, down and out at dinner, deep plunge every night. And next day, eye blinking headache, done in by the dizzy dreaming. The poor heart has its ways. The head never hears, nor the liver processes, adamant to a fault. Get over here. Where's that? Atop the greasy pole. And should I lose my grip, slip, don't slide. And if I slide, take your money and ride over the hills and o'er the plains like Mighty Mouse, or wait, forgot his name. As bees in hives and wolves in packs, fox and clover, bear in den, hare on lair, foots in head, shoe for the boot. How do you do? Wave, wave, ye bleak republic, futz and fizzle, as all things go, drizzle in obliquy, fall or fail or rally round the, where up's up a loop, but down the place to be, for Johnny and Jimmy and Bobby McBee, for Harry and Rudy, for Jack and for Joe, come Gretchen and Marilyn, come Cyanid and Flo. And then it all turns round. What's up comes down and round and round. What's out's in, and I'm in a pickle, no idea how to swim. Free at last, free my intellect from trash, free to follow the twists and burns of scratches and scores on panes and weather vanes. High up, bombed, and back next day preaching amidst the scowls. Never one professing, cept my love, never confessing, cept my love. But from where I sit, sight unseen, with heart on sleeve and liver on boil, and people receding with no reprieve, guess I'll perseverate till endings won't end. I'll pour out my blathering, hiss and tell. I'll never bend nor flip nor break until I fall to rise and rise to fall, and rude my hobby horse, chorus, hobby horse, from dusk to dawn.
Thank you
so much.
Well, thank you so much for publishing those poems.
I translated these poems. Really, I liked them. Thank you so much.
Well, my great pleasure.
Charles,
pleasure.
thank you very much for joining us. It was really a great to have you as our guest in here in Turkey. That's all for now. I hope we meet again. We see.
I hope so. I hope we meet in person, either here in New York or in Turkey.
I hope
we are waiting again to Istanbul, please.
Yes, I'd very much like to do that. This is a really great pleasure for me to meet you in person, and right from the interview to now, it's been a great experience, and I'm grateful to all of you for that.
Thank you very much. So it's time to leave. And send our regards to Susan.
I will.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
So much. Bye-bye.